The day my daughter told me I was just an expense, I didn't cry. I stood in the kitchen of the house I'd paid off 20 years ago, watching her lawyer tap his pen against a leather folder embossed with gold initials. Outside, the February rain hammered the windows. My hands were still damp from washing breakfast dishes when Rebecca said those exact words, her voice flat and businesslike. She'd inherited $33 million from her father's uncle exactly 72 hours earlier, and now she wanted me gone by sunset. The lawyer cleared his throat and mentioned something about optimizing her asset portfolio. I looked at the ceramic hummingbird on the windowsill, the one Rebecca made in 3rd grade, its wing still chipped from when the cat knocked it over. That hummingbird had survived 18 moves. If you've ever been blindsided by someone you raised, drop your city below and subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for both of us. The inheritance came from Douglas Brenner, Rebecca's great-uncle on her father's side. I'd met the man exactly twice, both times at funerals, where he spent more time on his phone than talking to family. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate across the Midwest, buying up warehouse districts in Cincinnati and Indianapolis before they became trendy. When he died at 89 without children, his will left everything to Rebecca specifically, because as his attorney explained, she was the only family member who'd sent him a birthday card every single year since she turned 16. I remember helping her pick out those cards at the drugstore, never imagining they were investments. The lawyer, a man named Griffith with silver cufflinks, slid a document across my kitchen table. Rebecca sat beside him, her expression unreadable. She wore the pearl earrings I'd given her for college graduation. That detail somehow made it worse. The document was a 30-day eviction notice. Griffith explained that while I technically had tenant rights despite never paying rent, Rebecca was prepared to compensate me with $15,000 for immediate voluntary departure. The money sat on the table in a cashier's check, already made out to my name. My daughter hadn't looked at me once since they arrived. She studied her manicured nails instead, the French tips perfect and expensive. I asked her why. Just that one word. She finally met my eyes and said I'd always been a financial burden, that her father had complained about supporting me throughout their marriage, and now that she had real wealth, she needed to make smart decisions. Her voice never wavered. Griffith added that the property value would increase significantly with renovations, and my presence complicated the timeline. He said it kindly, like he was doing me a favor by explaining. I picked up the cashier's check and set it back down without looking at the amount. The paper made a soft sound against the wood table. Rain continued its assault on the roof, and I thought about how I'd replaced those shingles myself 3 summers ago, spending a week on a borrowed ladder because I couldn't afford contractors. Rebecca's father, my ex-husband Tom, had died 6 years earlier from a heart attack, leaving her with his life insurance, but me with nothing except this house, which had been in my name before we married. She'd lived here rent-free for the past 2 years while finding herself after her marketing job downsized her department. I'd bought her groceries, I'd paid her car insurance, I'd never once called her a burden or asked for a timeline on when she'd contribute. But apparently, she'd been keeping score the whole time. The ceramic hummingbird caught my eye again. I stood and walked to the windowsill, picking it up carefully. The glaze was uneven where her small fingers had smoothed it, and the blue paint had faded from years in the sun. Rebecca tensed when I held it, probably thinking I'd throw it or make some dramatic gesture. Instead, I wrapped it in a dish towel and placed it in my purse. Griffith shuffled his papers, clearly uncomfortable with the silence. I told them I'd be gone by morning, not sunset, because I didn't need 30 days or $15,000 to know when I wasn't wanted. Rebecca's jaw tightened, the first real emotion she'd shown. She started to say something, but Griffith touched her arm, a subtle gesture that silenced her. He thanked me for being reasonable and promised to have the locks changed by noon tomorrow as a security measure. That word, security, hung in the air like an accusation. I packed one suitcase that night, mostly clothes and photographs. My sister Janet lived 40 minutes away in Greenfield, and she'd been after me for years to move closer. I called her from my bedroom while Rebecca and Griffith talked in the living room, their voices low and strategic. Janet answered on the first ring. When I told her what happened, she went silent for so long I thought the call dropped. Then she said to come immediately, that her guest room was mine for as long as I needed, and that Rebecca had always been spoiled, but this exceeded anything she'd imagined. I could hear Janet's husband Mark in the background, asking what was wrong, his voice rising when she explained. They were good people. Tom had never liked Mark, because Mark worked as a high school teacher and didn't make enough money, in Tom's estimation, to deserve respect. I'd always suspected Rebecca inherited more from her father than just his hair color. Block 1. Complete. 1,007 words. I left at 6 the next morning while Rebecca was still asleep. The house was quiet except for the furnace clicking on and the sound of my suitcase wheels on the hardwood floor I'd refinished by hand. I left the cashier's check on the kitchen counter with a note that said simply, "I never wanted your money, just your respect." The ceramic hummingbird went into my purse again, wrapped now in a clean sock for extra protection. I took one last look at the living room where I'd celebrated Rebecca's birthdays, hosted her graduation party, nursed her through breakups and flu seasons. The morning light came through the east window the way it always did, illuminating dust motes in the air. I'd hung those curtains myself, I'd painted those walls, I'd chosen every piece of furniture with care and saved money. But none of it mattered, because ownership means everything, and my daughter owned it now. Janet met me at her front door with coffee already made and tears in her eyes. Her house was smaller than mine, a 2-bedroom ranch with a cluttered warmth that came from raising 3 kids in limited space. Mark had already left for school, but he'd made up the guest bed with fresh sheets and left a note on the pillow welcoming me. I sat at Janet's kitchen table and finally cried. Not dramatic sobs, but the quiet kind that comes from exhaustion and betrayal. Janet didn't offer platitudes or tell me Rebecca would come around. She just refilled my coffee and said we'd figure things out together. Her cat, an orange tabby named Biscuit, jumped into my lap and started purring. Animals always know when you need them. I stroked his fur and told Janet everything, including the part about the eviction notice and Griffith's silver cufflinks and how Rebecca wouldn't look at me. Janet asked if I'd kept any documentation of the house being in my name. I told her yes. The deed was in my safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown, along with my birth certificate and my mother's wedding ring. Janet's expression shifted, became calculating in a way I'd seen before when she helped her son fight a parking ticket. She asked if Rebecca knew about the deed. I realized then that I'd never specifically shown it to her, never sat her down and explained the legal particulars. Tom and I had married when Rebecca was 2, and the house had been my grandmother's before mine, passed down with specific language about it remaining separate property even after marriage. The lawyer who handled my grandmother's estate had been very clear about that. His name was Warren Phelps, and he'd retired 5 years ago, but his son had taken over the practice. Janet suggested we call them immediately. Warren Phelps Jr. agreed to see me that afternoon. His office was in the same building his father had used, a converted Victorian near the courthouse with creaky stairs and too much wood paneling. He was younger than I expected, maybe 40, with kind eyes and his father's careful way of listening. I explained the situation while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked if I'd signed anything when Rebecca's lawyer visited. I said no. I'd only been shown the eviction notice, not asked to acknowledge it formally. Warren leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. He said the situation was unusual but not unprecedented, and that if I was the legal owner of the property, Rebecca had no authority to evict me, regardless of her inheritance. The house wasn't part of her windfall. It was mine, period. But there was more, he said, his expression growing serious. Warren pulled up Douglas Brenner's will on his computer, explaining that as a member of the state bar, he had access to probate filings. The will was 47 pages long, dense with legal language about trusts and distributions and contingencies. He scrolled through it slowly, his finger tracking lines of text. Then he stopped at page 23, section 12, subsection C. He turned the monitor so I could see it clearly. The clause stated that Rebecca would receive the full $33 million in a lump sum, but only if she maintained family relationships in good standing, and allowed Douglas's favorite nephew, meaning Tom's younger brother Carl, to audit the distribution. If Rebecca failed to honor family obligations, the inheritance would revert to a charitable trust after a contestation period. The contestation period ended at exactly noon. 72 hours after the initial distribution. That was today. My heart started pounding. Warren checked his watch, an old Timex that had probably been his father's. It was 9:45 in the morning. He asked if anyone had explained this clause to Rebecca. I said Griffith had mentioned asset portfolio optimization, but nothing about family obligations or contestation periods. Warren's expression darkened. He said it sounded like either Griffith was incompetent or deliberately keeping Rebecca ignorant, possibly to collect fees before complications arose. He asked if I'd told anyone where I was staying. I said only Janet. He asked if Rebecca had tried to contact me. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Rebecca, all within the last 20 minutes, and 2 voicemail messages. My hands shook as I opened the voicemail app. Warren told me to put it on speaker. We needed to document everything now. The first message was Rebecca's voice, higher pitched than normal, almost panicked. She said she needed to talk to me immediately, that Griffith had made a mistake, that there were complications with the inheritance she didn't understand. She asked where I was staying and said it was urgent. The timestamp showed she'd called at 9:15. The second message came at 9:30. This time, Rebecca was crying, her words tumbling over each other. She said Carl had shown up at the house with his own lawyer, demanding to see proof that she'd maintained family relationships, and that the inheritance could be contested if she'd violated the conditions. She said she'd tried to show them the cashier's check she'd offered me, but Carl claimed evicting me proved she'd broken the clause. She begged me to call her back, said she'd made a terrible mistake, that she was sorry. The message ended with her sobbing. Block 2 complete. 2,039 words. Warren sat forward, elbows on his desk. He asked if I wanted to respond immediately, or wait. I looked at the clock on his wall, a brass ship's wheel that seemed too nautical for a landlocked office. It was 9:52. Rebecca had 18 minutes before noon. 18 minutes before $33 million potentially vanished because she'd called me an expense and handed me an eviction notice. Janet had driven me to Warren's office, and she was in the waiting room reading a magazine. I could hear her coughing through the door. Warren said the decision was entirely mine, that I had no legal obligation to help Rebecca, but that he wanted me to understand the full picture before choosing. He pulled out another document, this one a printout he'd prepared while I was listening to the voicemails. It was Douglas Brenner's obituary from the Cincinnati Enquirer. The obituary described Douglas as a devoted family man who valued loyalty above all else. It mentioned his deceased wife Martha, his nephews Tom and Carl, and his great-niece Rebecca. There was a paragraph about his business philosophy, which centered on relationships and trust. He'd apparently written in a letter to his attorney that he'd watched too many inheritances destroy families, and he wanted his money to either strengthen bonds or go to charity. The letter was quoted directly in the probate filing. Douglas wrote, "If my heirs cannot treat each other with basic decency and respect, they deserve nothing from me. Let the money feed the hungry instead." Warren said this kind of conditional inheritance was tricky to enforce, but Douglas had structured it cleverly. Carl wasn't inheriting anything himself. He was just the designated watchdog, which meant he had no financial incentive to lie. If he could prove Rebecca violated the terms, the money went to the American Red Cross. I asked Warren what counted as maintaining family relationships in good standing. He read directly from the will. The language specified that beneficiaries must not willfully sever familial bonds through eviction, financial abandonment, or deliberate cruelty toward blood relatives within the contestation period. After that 72-hour window, Rebecca could do whatever she wanted. The money would be fully hers. But Douglas had inserted this grace period deliberately, Warren explained, probably to test whether sudden wealth would immediately corrupt his heirs. It was eccentric, but legal. I thought about Douglas at those funerals, watching everyone interact, probably taking mental notes about who was genuine and who was performing. He'd seemed distracted on his phone, but maybe he'd been observing more carefully than anyone realized. Rebecca had sent him birthday cards, but she'd just tried to evict the mother who raised her. That irony would have interested Douglas. My phone buzzed with another call from Rebecca. I let it go to voicemail. Warren said nothing, just waited. The clock ticked toward 10 o'clock. I thought about the ceramic hummingbird in my purse, about third-grade Rebecca with clay under her fingernails, so proud of what she'd made. I thought about teenage Rebecca crying over her first breakup while I held her and promised it would get better. I thought about adult Rebecca sitting in my kitchen, calling me an expense without flinching. Warren finally spoke, his voice careful. He said that if I wanted to contest the inheritance myself, I had grounds, both because the house was mine and because Rebecca's actions clearly violated Douglas's terms. But that would take months of litigation and might not succeed. The simpler path was to let the noon deadline pass and let the charity have it. Rebecca would learn an expensive lesson, and I'd keep my house. Janet knocked on the door and poked her head in. She said Rebecca had just called her, hysterical, begging for my location. Janet told her no and hung up. Now Mark was calling, saying Rebecca had found his number somehow and was calling him too. She was apparently driving around Greenfield looking for Janet's house, though she'd only been there once years ago for a Christmas party and probably didn't remember the address. Carl had given her until noon to produce evidence that she hadn't violated the terms, and the only evidence that would work was me, present and willing to state that our relationship was intact. Without that, Carl's lawyer would file the contestation paperwork at 12:01, and the probate court would freeze the inheritance pending investigation. Warren added that even if Rebecca found me, I'd have to be willing to sign an affidavit saying she'd acted in good faith. The question was whether I'd do that. I stood and walked to Warren's window. His office overlooked Main Street, where morning shoppers moved between the bakery and the pharmacy. A mother held her daughter's hand while they waited at the crosswalk. The little girl clutched a stuffed animal, maybe a bear. I remembered holding Rebecca's hand the same way, how small her fingers were, how much trust she placed in me to guide her safely. I'd never imagined a day when she'd be the one hurting me. Warren's clock showed 10:14. My phone buzzed again, but this time it was a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message said, "This is Carl Brenner. Your daughter is about to lose everything because she treated you terribly. You owe her nothing, but I wanted you to know that if you choose to help her, I'll respect that too. My uncle valued mercy as much as justice. The choice is yours." The message ended with his signature and a phone number. Block 3 complete. 3,064 words. I showed the text to Warren. He whistled low and said Carl was covering his bases, making sure no one could accuse him of preventing reconciliation. Smart. I asked what would happen if I did nothing, just stayed in this office until 12:05. Warren said the inheritance would be contested. A lengthy legal process would begin, and Rebecca would likely lose most or all of the money to legal fees, even if she somehow won, which was unlikely given the evidence. She'd also probably lose the house when I proved ownership. She'd walk away with almost nothing except debt from Griffith's fees. I asked what would happen if I signed the affidavit. Warren said Rebecca would keep the $33 million, and I'd go back to being the mother of a very wealthy daughter who'd tried to evict me. Whether that relationship could be repaired was between us. The money itself wouldn't fix what she'd broken. Janet came fully into the office and closed the door behind her. She said we needed to talk, just the two of us, and asked Warren for a moment. He nodded and stepped out, taking his coffee mug with him. Janet sat in the chair he'd vacated and took both my hands in hers. She said she'd been thinking about Mom, our mother, who died 10 years ago from pneumonia. Mom had always said that love without boundaries was weakness, but boundaries without love were cruelty. Janet said Rebecca needed to learn that actions have consequences, but I also needed to decide whether I wanted a relationship with my daughter moving forward or not. If I let the deadline pass, Rebecca would probably never forgive me, and I'd lose her permanently. If I helped her, she'd at least have the chance to grow and make amends. Neither choice was wrong, Janet said. Both had costs. I asked Janet what she'd do in my position. She laughed, a bitter sound, and said she'd probably let the deadline pass because she was more vindictive than me. But she also said I wasn't her, and I'd always been too forgiving, sometimes to my detriment. She reminded me of the time Tom forgot our anniversary 3 years running, and I made excuses for him each time until finally Janet sat me down and told me to demand better. I had, and Tom had improved, marginally. But Rebecca wasn't Tom. She was younger, and maybe more salvageable. Janet said the question wasn't whether Rebecca deserved my help, it was whether I could live with myself either way. She squeezed my hands and said she'd support whatever I decided, but I needed to decide soon. The clock showed 10:28. I had 92 minutes left to change someone's life or let consequences unfold naturally. Warren returned with fresh coffee for all of us. He'd brought a third document, this one a template affidavit. He said if I chose to help Rebecca, we'd need to fill this out immediately and have it notarized before noon. His secretary was a notary, so that part was simple. But the affidavit would require me to state under penalty of perjury that Rebecca and I had a positive relationship and that she'd acted toward me with respect and consideration. I laughed at that last part, a harsh sound that surprised me. Warren said I could interpret respect and consideration broadly, and that Douglas's clause was about intent more than perfection. If I believed Rebecca had tried, even poorly, to maintain our relationship, that might be enough, but I'd have to say it under oath, and if I was lying, there could be legal consequences later. He said it neutrally, without judgment, just laying out the facts. My phone rang again. This time I answered. Rebecca's voice came through immediately, breathless and desperate. She said she was sorry, that she'd been stupid and cruel, that Griffith had convinced her I was holding her back financially. She said she'd fired Griffith an hour ago, when she realized he'd never mentioned the family clause, and that she'd been trying to find me to apologize in person. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. I asked where she was. She said she was parked outside Janet's neighborhood, trying to remember which house was hers, but everything looked the same. I could hear car sounds in the background, the engine running. She said Carl was being decent about it, giving her the full time, but she'd wasted so much of it already. She had 90 minutes, 89 now. She was begging me to tell her where I was. I muted the phone and looked at Warren. He was watching me with his father's careful expression, the one that said he'd seen every kind of human behavior and wasn't surprised by any of it anymore. I asked him if he thought people could change. He said yes, but usually only when they hit bottom hard enough to shatter something inside them. He said Rebecca was hitting bottom right now, and what I did next would determine whether she shattered in a way that could be repaired or in a way that stayed broken forever. It wasn't fair that I had to make this choice. It wasn't fair that her terrible behavior put this weight on me. But fairness, Warren said, was a luxury we rarely got in family law. We got choices and consequences and the hope that we could live with both. His clock showed 10:38. I unmuted the phone. Block 4. Complete. 4,095 words. I told Rebecca to meet me at Warren Phelps Jr.'s office on Main Street. She knew where the old Victorian was because we'd driven past it countless times. I said she had 15 minutes to get there, or I was leaving, and I'd turn off my phone. She started thanking me, but I hung up before she could finish. Janet raised her eyebrows. I told her I hadn't decided anything yet, except to hear Rebecca out in person. Janet said that was fair, but I should remember that Rebecca had fired Griffith not out of moral awakening, but because he'd screwed up and cost her money. The remorse might be about dollars more than damage. Warren said we'd know soon enough and asked his secretary to clear his schedule for the next 90 minutes. She was a woman about my age named Patricia, and she gave me a sympathetic look that said she'd heard everything through the door and had opinions, but would keep them professional. Rebecca arrived in 12 minutes. I heard her footsteps pounding up the stairs, fast and uneven. Warren's door was open, and she burst through it wild-eyed, her hair messy, her expensive blouse wrinkled. She saw me and stopped like she'd hit a wall. For a moment, we just looked at each other. She was breathing hard from running or panic or both. Her mascara had smeared beneath one eye. The pearl earrings I'd given her were gone, replaced with small diamond studs I'd never seen before. Probably something she'd bought with her new money. Warren gestured to the empty chair beside me. Rebecca sat carefully, like she thought I might vanish if she moved too fast. Janet had positioned herself by the window, arms crossed, her face neutral, but her body language protective. Patricia stood in the doorway with her notary stamp, watching everything. Rebecca started talking immediately. She said Griffith had told her that wealthy people had to make hard choices, that family could be a liability, that I represented an era of her life she needed to move past. She said it sounded sophisticated and mature when he explained it in his office with the leather chairs and the mahogany desk. She said she'd convinced herself I'd be fine, that $15,000 was generous, that I'd probably move in with Janet anyway and be happier. She said she didn't think about the house being mine because her father had always talked about it like it was his, like he'd provided it, even though he'd only paid utilities and repairs. She was crying again, her words tumbling out. She said when Carl showed up with the clause information, her first thought wasn't about the money. It was about what she'd done to me. She said she'd realized in that moment how much she'd become like her father. That last part made me sit up straighter. Rebecca had never criticized Tom before, not even after he died. She'd always defended him when Janet or Mark made comments. Now she was comparing herself to him, and clearly not as a compliment. She said Tom had taught her that money meant power and power meant freedom, and she'd internalized that lesson so deeply she didn't realize she was wielding it like a weapon. She said the look on my face yesterday when I picked up the ceramic hummingbird had haunted her all night. She'd barely slept. When Griffith called this morning to check on the eviction timeline, she'd asked him about the family clause, and he'd gone silent for a full minute before admitting he'd thought it was boilerplate language. That wouldn't matter. That's when she'd fired him and called Carl directly. Carl had been kind, but firm. No signed affidavit from me, no inheritance. The rules were clear. Warren interrupted to ask Rebecca what she wanted from this meeting. She looked at him, then at me. She said she wanted to apologize, truly apologize, and ask if there was any way I'd consider signing the affidavit. She said she understood if I refused, that she deserved to lose the money, but she hoped I'd at least let her try to repair our relationship afterward. She said the money didn't matter compared to having a mother who'd speak to her. Janet made a small sound of disbelief. Rebecca glanced at her, then back at me. She said she knew that sounded convenient now, with the deadline approaching, but she'd been thinking it since 3 in the morning when she couldn't sleep and realized she'd traded her last parent for a bank balance. She said she'd been thinking about the ceramic hummingbird, about how I'd wrapped it carefully and taken it with me instead of smashing it. She didn't know why that detail stuck with her, but it did. I pulled the hummingbird from my purse, still wrapped in the sock. I set it on Warren's desk between us. The blue glaze caught the overhead light, still uneven and imperfect after all these years. Rebecca stared at it like it was evidence in a trial, which maybe it was. I said I'd taken it because it represented the daughter I'd raised, the one who made things with her hands and was proud of them even when they weren't perfect. I said I'd left behind everything else because material things could be replaced, but that little girl who made this hummingbird couldn't be. I asked Rebecca if that little girl still existed somewhere under the expensive clothes and the bad advice from lawyers. She reached toward the hummingbird but didn't touch it. She said she hoped so, that she'd been trying to find her again since yesterday. Her hand hovered over the ceramic, shaking slightly. Warren cleared his throat and said we had 55 minutes until noon. If we were going to do the affidavit, we needed to start now. He slid the template across his desk so I could see it clearly. The language was formal, but straightforward. It asked me to affirm that Rebecca Lee Brenner was my daughter, that we maintained a familial relationship, and that she had not willfully severed our bond through eviction, abandonment, or cruelty during the contestation period. That last clause was the problem. She'd literally tried to evict me 36 hours ago. Warren said the phrase, willfully severed, was open to interpretation. If I believed Rebecca had acted on bad advice rather than malice, and if I believed our bond wasn't actually severed, I could sign truthfully. But it was my call. Patricia the notary said she'd need to see my ID and watch me sign. She'd also need to confirm I was acting freely, without coercion. She looked at Rebecca when she said that last part. Block 5 complete. 5,149 words. I asked everyone to leave the room except Rebecca. Warren hesitated, then nodded and ushered Janet and Patricia into the waiting area. He closed the door softly behind him. The office suddenly felt smaller, just me and my daughter and the ceramic hummingbird on the desk between us. Outside, I could hear Patricia answering a phone call, her voice muffled. Rebecca was still staring at the hummingbird. I said we needed to talk honestly, without lawyers or witnesses or the pressure of a deadline. I said I wanted to know if she actually loved me or if she just loved what I could give her. She flinched like I'd slapped her. She said that was a horrible question. I said it was a fair one given the circumstances. She started crying again, but I didn't comfort her. I waited. She needed to find the words herself this time. Rebecca said she loved me, but she'd lost sight of it somewhere between college and her father's death and the disappointment of her career not going how she'd planned. She said every time she came to me for help, she felt like she was failing, and eventually that feeling curdled into resentment. She said Tom used to talk about me in ways she didn't recognize at the time as disrespectful, but looking back, she could see how he'd poisoned her thinking. He'd call me impractical and say I didn't understand the real world. He'd roll his eyes when I suggested things. Rebecca said she'd absorbed those attitudes without questioning them, and when the inheritance came, Griffith had simply reinforced what she already half believed. She said that didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained how she'd gotten to the point where she could hand me an eviction notice without recognizing the enormity of what she was doing. I asked her what she'd do differently if I signed the affidavit. She said she'd transfer the house back to my name legally, with proper documentation, so there'd never be a question. She said she'd set up a trust fund that would cover my expenses for life, not as charity, but as repayment for all the years I'd supported her. She said she'd go to therapy to work through whatever Tom had broken in her sense of family. She said she'd probably give a lot of the money away because Douglas was right. It had already started changing her for the worse. She said all of this in a rush, like she'd been planning it during the drive over. I asked if she'd thought about any of that before Carl showed up. She went quiet. Then she admitted no. She'd been planning renovations and thinking about buying a condo in Chicago. She said the almost losing it part had clarified things in a way she was ashamed to admit. I picked up the ceramic hummingbird and turned it over in my hands. The bottom was rough where she'd carved her initials with a toothpick before it fired. RLB, Rebecca Lee Brenner. She'd been so proud of those initials, had practiced writing them in cursive for weeks afterward. I told her that I didn't care about the money, trust funds, or property transfers. I told her what I cared about was whether she'd call me next week, next month, next year, when the crisis was over and the inheritance was secure. I said I'd watched Tom's family operate on transaction-based relationships where people only called when they needed something, and I'd promised myself I'd never accept that from my own child. If I signed this paper, I needed to know she was committed to actually rebuilding what she'd damaged, not just saying the right words to make a deadline. She needed to prove it. I had 48 minutes to decide if I believed her. Rebecca said she'd prove it any way I wanted. I said words were easy when millions of dollars were on the line. I needed a gesture, something that cost her something real right now, before the inheritance was secure. She looked confused. I said, if she was serious about being a better daughter, she needed to give up something that mattered to her in this moment, not promise future donations or transfers. I wanted to see what she'd sacrifice without guarantee of return. Warren had been clear that if the deadline passed, the money was gone. If Rebecca gave something up now and I still didn't sign, she'd lose both. That was the test. She went pale. I could see her calculating, trying to figure out what I wanted. I didn't help her. The clock on Warren's wall ticked toward 11. She had to figure this out herself, or we were done. She stood abruptly and pulled out her phone. She made a call, pacing near the window. When someone answered, she said this was Rebecca Brenner, and she needed to speak with Carl immediately. There was a pause. Then Carl's voice came through, tinny on speakerphone. Rebecca said she wanted to make a binding commitment right now, before the deadline. If the inheritance came through, she'd donate $5 million to a charity in my name, and the donation would be irrevocable and immediate, executed within 7 business days. Carl asked which charity. Rebecca looked at me. I said the local food bank where I'd volunteered every Thursday for the past 8 years. Rebecca repeated it to Carl. He said that was admirable, but asked why she was telling him. Rebecca said she wanted him to witness it and hold her accountable because she knew her mother wouldn't believe promises without enforcements. Carl was quiet for a moment. Then he said he'd write it up and have it ready to file the moment the inheritance cleared. Rebecca thanked him and ended the call. Block 6 complete. 6,171 words, $5 million. It was more money than I'd ever imagined in one place, let alone attached to my name going to a cause I cared about. Rebecca sat back down, her hands shaking. She said that was her gesture, her sacrifice, because $5 million was enough to change the trajectory of hungry families in our county, and she'd never be able to take it back or resent it because Carl would make sure it went through. She said even if I didn't sign and she lost everything, at least I'd know she'd been willing to commit something real. I asked how she'd pay the $5 million if the inheritance didn't come through. She admitted she couldn't. Her savings account had maybe $8,000. But that was the point, she said. She was betting everything on my willingness to give her another chance, which was exactly what I'd asked for. A sacrifice without guarantee. Her eyes were red from crying. She looked exhausted and young and terrified. I stood and opened Warren's door. He was sitting with Janet and Patricia, all three of them drinking coffee like they were waiting for a verdict. I asked Warren to come back in and bring the affidavit. Janet followed, and Patricia came with her notary stamp. We all crowded into the office, which suddenly felt very full. Warren set the affidavit in front of me and offered me a pen, an old-fashioned fountain pen that probably had sentimental value. Rebecca watched me with the expression of someone watching their entire future balance on a knife edge. The clock showed 11:16. I had 44 minutes before her inheritance evaporated. Janet touched my shoulder, a gesture of support regardless of what I chose. Patricia arranged her stamp and forms, ready to make it official if I decided to sign. The ceramic hummingbird sat in the center of the desk like a tiny judge. I read the affidavit slowly, every word. The legal language was dense, but Warren had highlighted the key sections in yellow. I had to swear that Rebecca had not willfully severed our familial bond through eviction, abandonment, or deliberate cruelty during the contestation period. The word willfully kept jumping out at me. Had she acted with full intention to harm me? Or had she acted on terrible advice while in a fog of sudden wealth? Warren said interpretation mattered. Intent mattered. I thought about Rebecca at 3 a.m, unable to sleep, thinking about the ceramic hummingbird. I thought about her firing Griffith despite the chaos it created. I thought about her calling Carl to commit $5 million before knowing if I'd help her. These weren't the actions of someone who wanted me gone. These were the actions of someone who'd made a catastrophic mistake and was scrambling to fix it. I picked up the fountain pen. It was heavier than expected, the barrel made of dark wood with brass fittings. Warren said it had been his father's, that his father had signed hundreds of important documents with it, including his own will. He said I could use a regular pen if I preferred, but I shook my head. Something about the weight of the fountain pen felt appropriate for the moment. Rebecca was holding her breath, literally not breathing, her face pale. Janet squeezed my shoulder harder. Patricia positioned herself to witness my signature. I looked at Rebecca one more time and said if I did this, she'd be accountable not just to Carl and the inheritance terms, but to me. I said I expected weekly phone calls. I expected birthday visits. I expected her to show up when life got hard instead of pulling away. She nodded so vigorously I thought her neck might hurt. I signed my name on the designated line. My signature looked strange in fountain pen ink, darker and more permanent than ballpoint. Patricia immediately stepped forward with her notary stamp and asked for my driver's license. I handed it to her, and she verified the information, then asked me to confirm I was signing freely without coercion. I said yes. She asked if I understood the contents of the document. I said yes. She applied the stamp with a heavy thunking sound that seemed to echo in the small office. It was official now. 11:23. We had 37 minutes to get this to Carl. Warren said he'd already called Carl's lawyer to expect the document and that he'd scan and email it immediately while we drove the original to Carl's location. Rebecca gave him the address, a law office downtown about 15 minutes away. Warren's scanner hummed to life. Rebecca hugged me so hard I lost my breath. She was crying and thanking me and apologizing all at once, her words muffled against my shoulder. I patted her back awkwardly, still processing what I'd just done. Janet pulled her off me and said we needed to move if we were delivering the original document. Warren handed me the affidavit, now notarized and official, the paper still warm from the scanner. He said he'd email it within 2 minutes, but Carl would want the physical copy for his files. Patricia wished us luck. Warren said he'd bill me later for his time, but given the circumstances, he'd keep it minimal. I thanked him for everything. He shook my hand with both of his and said his father would have liked how this turned out. I wasn't sure I agreed, but I appreciated the sentiment. We rushed down the stairs, Rebecca leading the way. Janet drove because both Rebecca and I were too emotional to be trusted behind a wheel. Rebecca sat in the back, her phone pressed to her ear, talking to Carl to confirm the affidavit was coming. Carl apparently said the email had just arrived and looked properly executed, but he still wanted the original before he'd sign off completely. He was thorough, which I respected. We hit traffic on Elm Street, where construction had narrowed 2 lanes to 1. Janet swore under her breath and pulled into a parking lot to take a side street. Rebecca was checking the time every 30 seconds, her anxiety visible in every gesture. It was 11:31. We had 29 minutes. The side street was clear and Janet drove faster than she should have, but no one complained. The ceramic hummingbird was still in my purse, wrapped in its sock, pressing against my hip like a reminder of what was at stake. Block 7 complete. 7,201 words. Carl's lawyer's office was in a modern building near the courthouse, all glass and steel, the opposite of Warren's Victorian charm. We parked in a loading zone because finding legal parking would take too long. Rebecca jumped out before Janet even turned off the engine. I followed with the affidavit clutched in my hand. The lobby had marble floors, and our footsteps echoed as we rushed to the elevator. A security guard asked if we had an appointment. Rebecca said yes. With Carl Brenner, it was urgent. He checked his tablet and nodded, directing us to the 7th floor. The elevator felt impossibly slow. Rebecca kept pressing the button like that would make it move faster. When the doors finally opened on 7, she sprinted down the hallway. I walked quickly but refused to run. My dignity had limits. We found the right office at 11:38. 22 minutes remained. Carl Brenner was waiting in the conference room with 2 lawyers and a woman I assumed was a paralegal based on the laptop and stack of folders in front of her. He stood when we entered, and I got my first good look at him. He was younger than Tom had been, maybe 50, with Tom's same nose but kinder eyes. He shook my hand and said it was good to finally meet me properly, that we'd only crossed paths at Tom's funeral, and he'd always meant to reach out afterward. He seemed genuine. One of his lawyers, a woman with sharp features and sharper suit, took the affidavit from me and examined it closely. She compared it to the emailed version on her laptop, checking every line. She asked Patricia's notary commission number and called someone to verify it was current. Carl offered us water. Rebecca declined. I accepted. My mouth was dry from stress and too much coffee. The lawyer finished her verification and nodded to Carl. She said the affidavit appeared legitimate and properly executed. Carl thanked her and turned to me. He said he needed to ask me directly if everything I'd signed was true, if Rebecca had truly not severed our relationship. I looked at Rebecca, who was watching me with desperate hope. I told Carl the truth, that Rebecca had made a terrible mistake under bad advice, but that mistakes weren't the same as malice. I said she'd taken immediate action to correct course when she understood what she'd done. I said our relationship had been damaged, but not destroyed, and that I believed it could be repaired. Carl listened carefully, then asked if I was staying at my own home. I explained about the house ownership, how it had always been mine. His expression shifted to understanding. He said so Rebecca never actually had the authority to evict me in the first place. I confirmed that was correct. Carl looked at his lawyers. The sharp-featured woman said that complicated things because if Rebecca lacked authority to evict, then the eviction attempt might not count as a legitimate action under the will's terms. It might be more like a failed threat than an actual severance. The other lawyer, an older man with gray at his temples, disagreed. He said intent mattered more than authority, and Rebecca's intent to evict was clear regardless of whether she legally could. They started debating precedents and interpretations while the clock ticked toward 11:45. 15 minutes left. Rebecca looked like she might be sick. Carl held up his hand, and both lawyers went quiet. He said his Uncle Douglas had appointed him as judge of character, not arbiter of legal technicalities. The question was whether Rebecca deserved the inheritance based on her treatment of family. He looked at me again and asked what I thought Douglas would have wanted. I said I'd only met Douglas twice, but both times I'd noticed he watched how people treated service staff, how they talked about absent family members, how they behaved when they thought no one important was looking. I said Douglas seemed like someone who valued growth over perfection, redemption over punishment. I said if Rebecca learned from this experience and became a better person, that seemed more in line with Douglas's values than permanently punishing her for one very bad day under extraordinary circumstances. I said the $5 million commitment to the food bank suggested she was already changing her thinking. Carl asked when that commitment was made. Rebecca explained it was before I'd signed anything, when there was no guarantee she'd keep the inheritance. Carl smiled slightly. He said that was the kind of detail his uncle would have appreciated. He checked his watch. 11:48. 12 minutes remained. Carl stood and walked to the window. The view overlooked downtown, the buildings casting long shadows in the late morning sun. He was quiet for so long I thought we'd lost, despite everything. Then he turned back and said he was satisfied that the conditions of the will had been met. Rebecca had maintained family relationships in good standing, broadly interpreted, and the contestation period would expire without challenge. His lawyers would file the appropriate paperwork with probate court confirming the inheritance was uncontested. The $33 million would be released to Rebecca within 5 business days. She could expect a call from the bank by Wednesday afternoon. He congratulated her and said he hoped she'd use the money wisely. Rebecca burst into tears again, but this time they seemed like relief, more than panic. Carl shook my hand again and thanked me for coming. He said he'd hold her to the food bank commitment personally. Block 8, complete, 8,217 words. We left Carl's office at 11:52, 8 minutes before the deadline. Rebecca was sobbing in the elevator, great heaving sobs that made the other passenger edge away uncomfortably. I put my arm around her, and she leaned into me like she used to when she was small and scared. Janet was waiting in the car, still in the loading zone, arguing with a parking enforcement officer. When she saw us emerge, she broke off mid-sentence and jumped back in the car. We piled in, and she drove off before the officer could write the ticket. Rebecca laughed through her tears and said we just saved $33 million, and now we were fleeing a parking ticket. It was absurd enough to be funny. Janet said the officer could mail her the damn ticket. She wasn't about to let paperwork ruin our dramatic exit. We drove back toward Janet's house, the tension finally releasing from the car like air from an overfilled balloon. At Janet's house, we sat in her kitchen and drank sweet tea while Rebecca called the bank to confirm everything was still on track. They told her the funds were in a secure account and would transfer to her personal account, pending probate clearance. She asked about the timeline for making large donations. They said once the transfer completed, she could initiate any transaction she wanted, though amounts over $1 million required additional documentation and a meeting with a private banker. She scheduled that meeting for Thursday. When she hung up, she looked at me and asked if I'd come to that meeting with her. She said she wanted me there when she set up the food bank donation, wanted me to see her follow through. I said yes. I also said we needed to talk about the house situation and get the deed properly sorted. She agreed immediately. Over the next 3 days, Rebecca stayed at a hotel rather than the house that wasn't legally hers. She called me twice a day, morning and evening, just to talk. She told me about firing Griffith officially via certified letter and how he'd tried to bill her for services rendered. She told him to take it up with her new lawyer, Warren Phelps Jr., who'd agreed to represent her at a much more reasonable rate. She told me about looking at her finances with clear eyes for the first time and realizing how much of her spending had been about image rather than actual needs. She said she'd been trying to live like her father, who'd always acted richer than he was, and it had poisoned her thinking. She asked about my week, about Biscuit the cat, about whether I'd talked to any of my friends from the volunteer center. She was trying. I could hear the effort in every conversation. Thursday came, and we met at the bank. Rebecca's new private banker was a calm woman named Teresa, who'd handled large inheritances before and didn't seem impressed by the dollar amounts. She walked Rebecca through the transfer process, the tax implications, the investment options, and the charitable giving procedures. When Rebecca said she wanted to donate $5 million to the county food bank, Teresa didn't blink. She pulled up the forms and explained the tax benefits, the documentation requirements, and the timeline. Rebecca signed everything with me watching. Teresa said the food bank would receive notification within 48 hours and the funds would arrive within 7 business days. Rebecca asked if I could be listed as the sponsor of record. Teresa said absolutely. She printed a certificate that said the donation was made in honor of my name. Rebecca framed it later and hung it in her new apartment. The house situation took longer to resolve. Warren prepared a quitclaim deed that officially removed any cloud on my title and confirmed my sole ownership. Rebecca signed it without hesitation and paid the filing fees. She also insisted on setting up a trust fund that would pay my property taxes and insurance in perpetuity, plus a monthly stipend for maintenance and living expenses. I initially refused, but she said it wasn't charity, it was making things right. She said I'd spent 30 years putting her needs above my own financial security, and now she had the means to reverse that imbalance. I eventually accepted on the condition that she'd let me continue volunteering at the food bank rather than treating me like I needed to be taken care of. She agreed. Warren drew up the trust documents, and we signed them on a Tuesday afternoon in his office, with Patricia notarizing everything again. Her stamp was getting a workout. The food bank called me personally 3 weeks later. The director, a woman named Sharon who I'd worked with for years, said they'd received the $5 million donation and couldn't believe it. She asked if I'd had any involvement. I explained about Rebecca's inheritance and her decision to honor our relationship by supporting causes I cared about. Sharon cried on the phone. She said $5 million would let them expand to 3 new locations, buy a refrigerated truck, and partner with local farms to rescue produce that would otherwise go to waste. She said they wanted to name the new main facility after me. I told her to name it after Douglas Brenner instead, since his money was funding it and his values had inspired the donation. Sharon said they'd compromise and name it the Brenner Family Community Food Center. I agreed to that. Rebecca came to the dedication ceremony 6 months later and gave a speech about second chances. Block 9 complete, 9,254 words. Our relationship didn't heal overnight. There were awkward dinners where we ran out of things to say after 20 minutes. There were phone calls where old resentments bubbled up and we had to take breaks before finishing the conversation. Rebecca started therapy like she'd promised, and 3 months in, she asked if I'd join her for a session. Her therapist was a thoughtful woman who asked hard questions about patterns we'd both developed over years. We talked about Tom's influence, about how his transactional view of relationships had infected both of us in different ways. We talked about the difference between helping someone and enabling them, between setting boundaries and building walls. It was uncomfortable and necessary. We started having those joint sessions once a month. Slowly, carefully, we rebuilt something that felt more honest than what we'd had before. Rebecca stopped performing and started just being present. The ceramic hummingbird ended up on Rebecca's mantle in her new apartment, a place of honor where she saw it every day. She'd bought a modest 2-bedroom condo instead of the luxury penthouse Griffith had suggested, saying she wanted to live below her means until she figured out who she was with money. She got a part-time job at a marketing nonprofit, despite not needing the income, saying she needed structure and purpose beyond managing investments. She made new friends who didn't know about her inheritance. She dated a teacher she met at a coffee shop, someone who reminded me a little of Mark in his steady decency. She brought him to Sunday dinners at my house, which had become a weekly tradition. Janet and Mark came too, and we'd cook together and play cards afterward. It was ordinary and precious. Rebecca protected these evenings fiercely, turning down other invitations to keep the time sacred. The inheritance continued to grow through careful investments, and Rebecca became known for her charitable giving. She funded scholarships for first-generation college students. She donated to the local shelter where I'd gotten Biscuit years ago, allowing them to build a new wing. She partnered with other donors to revitalize the downtown area, creating small business grants for entrepreneurs who couldn't get traditional loans. She did all of it quietly, without press releases or naming rights, except when it might inspire other donors. She said Douglas had avoided publicity despite his wealth, and she wanted to honor that approach. Carl stayed in touch with both of us, visiting twice a year. He said watching Rebecca grow into the inheritance had been worth the stress of the contestation period. He said his uncle would have been proud of how she'd corrected course after nearly losing everything. On the anniversary of the day Rebecca had tried to evict me, she showed up at my door with flowers and a letter. The flowers were daisies, my favorite, from the farmer's market she'd started frequenting. The letter was handwritten on heavy stationery, 3 pages of her neat cursive. She said she'd been thinking about that day constantly, about how close she'd come to losing me permanently over pride and bad advice. She said the worst part wasn't almost losing the money. It was the moment she'd realized she'd become someone who'd treat her mother as disposable. She said she'd been reading Douglas's letters to his attorney, which Carl had shared with her, and one line had stuck with her. Douglas had written that wealth reveals character rather than creating it. She said her character that day had been ugly, shaped by her father's worst teachings and her own selfishness. But she'd been given a chance to do better, and she was trying every day. I read the letter twice, then hugged her for a long time. We sat on my porch with lemonade and watched the neighborhood kids play basketball in the street. Rebecca asked if I'd forgiven her. I said forgiveness was complicated, that I'd chosen to move forward with her, but the memory of that day would always exist. I said forgiveness didn't mean forgetting. It meant deciding the relationship was worth more than the hurt. She accepted that. She said she didn't want me to forget because she needed to remember what she was capable of when she lost sight of what mattered. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then she asked if I'd kept the cashier's check. I laughed and said yes. It was in my desk drawer, uncashed. She asked why I'd kept it. I said as a reminder that love couldn't be bought or sold, only given freely or withheld. She asked if I'd ever cash it. I said probably not. We developed new traditions over the following years. Every Thursday, Rebecca joined me at the food bank, sorting donations and packing boxes. She was terrible at it at first, disorganized and slow, but she improved with practice. The other volunteers warmed to her when they realized she was genuinely there to work, not perform charity for social credit. We started traveling together, modest trips to national parks where we'd hike and talk and be away from daily pressures. Rebecca always carried the ceramic hummingbird in her suitcase, wrapped carefully in bubble wrap. She said it was her good luck charm, her reminder of who she wanted to be. I told her she didn't need luck. She needed commitment, and she'd already proven she had that. She said carrying it helped anyway. Some symbols matter more than logic. I understood that. Block 10 complete, 10,098 words. The story could end there, with reconciliation and growth and everyone learning their lessons. But life kept happening in the way it does. 2 years after the inheritance, Janet was diagnosed with cancer. Aggressive, fast-moving, the kind that requires immediate action and extensive treatment. Mark called me at 2 a.m. when they got the diagnosis, his voice breaking. Rebecca was at my house within the hour despite living 30 minutes away. We drove to the hospital together in the dark. Janet was awake, angry, more than scared, saying the timing was terrible because she'd just planted a new garden. Rebecca held her hand and said they'd take care of the garden together, that Janet would be around to see it bloom. Janet said Rebecca better not kill her tomatoes. It was the most Janet response possible. We laughed because the alternative was falling apart, and Janet wouldn't have wanted that. Rebecca coordinated everything. She hired a medical advocate to help Janet navigate treatment options. She paid for consultations with specialists across the state. She arranged transportation to appointments and made sure Mark didn't have to miss work beyond the absolutely necessary days. She set up a meal train for their house and personally cooked twice a week, learning recipes from online videos because she'd never been skilled in the kitchen. She did it all without fanfare, without making Janet feel like a charity case. She did it like family helping family, which was exactly what it was. Janet told me privately that Rebecca had become the person she'd always hoped she would be. I agreed. The experience of almost losing everything had fundamentally changed my daughter's understanding of what mattered. Money could pay for the best doctors, but it couldn't replace showing up consistently with casseroles and company. Janet's treatment was brutal, but effective. She lost her hair and her strength, but never her sharpness. She'd make jokes from the chemo chair that had nurses laughing and shaking their heads. Rebecca was there for every session I couldn't make, reading to Janet or just sitting quietly when Janet was too tired to talk. Mark said later that Rebecca's presence had been a gift during the hardest months of his life. Janet went into remission after 9 months of treatment. The day we got the news, Rebecca brought champagne to the hospital room and we toasted with plastic cups. Janet said she'd better get another 10 years minimum after surviving that nightmare. Rebecca said she'd hold her to it. I thought about the ceramic hummingbird on Rebecca's mantle, how fragile things could survive against the odds when handled with enough care. People were the same way. We were all more breakable and more resilient than we realized. The food bank facility was completed around the same time Janet finished treatment. The dedication ceremony was on a Saturday in October. Perfect weather, with leaves turning gold and orange. The building was beautiful, modern and efficient, with industrial refrigerators and a commercial kitchen for cooking classes. Sharon gave a speech about how the donation had transformed their capacity to serve the community. She talked about the increase in families they could help, the partnerships they'd formed with schools and senior centers. She thanked the Brenner family for their generosity. Rebecca stood next to me during the speech, holding my hand like she used to as a child. Carl was there too, having flown in from Cincinnati specifically for the event. He told Rebecca afterward that Douglas would have loved seeing his money create something tangible that helped real people. That night, the local news ran a segment about the facility and briefly mentioned Rebecca's donation. Rebecca got a few calls from people she hadn't spoken to in years, suddenly interested in reconnecting now that they knew she was wealthy. She handled it gracefully, meeting them for coffee but declining to invest in their business ideas or fund their projects. She told me about each conversation, processing her feelings about being valued for her bank account rather than herself. I reminded her that she'd learned to recognize the difference now, which was the important thing. She agreed. She kept her circle small and genuine. Her boyfriend proposed around this time, a simple proposal during a hike where he'd packed the ring in his backpack. Rebecca called me from the trail, breathless with happiness. She said yes before he'd finished asking. The wedding was planned for the following spring, small and personal. She asked me to help with the planning, and we spent winter weekends looking at venues and tasting cakes, rebuilding our relationship one ordinary moment at a time. The wedding day arrived with unexpected snow, a late spring storm that blanketed everything in white. The venue had a backup indoor plan, but Rebecca decided the snow made everything magical and insisted on the outdoor ceremony anyway. We set up heaters and passed out blankets, and it was beautiful. Janet was there, her hair grown back in soft curls, healthy and laughing. Mark walked Rebecca down the aisle because she said he'd been more of a father to her in recent years than her actual father had ever been. Mark cried. I cried. Everyone cried because it was that kind of day. The ceramic hummingbird sat on the gift table as the centerpiece, a conversation piece that represented our history. Rebecca's vows mentioned second chances and the people who give them. Her husband's vows mentioned the ceramic hummingbird specifically, saying he'd learned about love by watching how Rebecca treasured imperfect things. It was perfect. Block 11 complete, 11,340 words. 3 years after the inheritance, Rebecca announced she was pregnant. She told me first, before even her husband, showing up at my house with a positive test and tears streaming down her face. Happy tears this time, excited and terrified tears. She said she wanted to be a better parent than her father had been, that she wanted her child to grow up understanding values instead of prices. She asked if I'd help her, if I'd be the kind of grandmother who was present and involved. I said, of course, that I'd been waiting for this. We sat together planning the nursery and talking about names and discussing all the ways she'd break family cycles. She was reading parenting books and taking classes and approaching motherhood with the same intensity she'd once applied to managing her inheritance. I told her to relax a little, that no amount of preparation could truly ready you for a baby. She laughed and said that was terrifying, but probably true. The baby, a girl named Clara, arrived in December. She had Rebecca's eyes and her husband's calm temperament. Rebecca called me from the hospital at 5 in the morning when Clara was born, her voice full of wonder. I drove through pre-dawn darkness to meet my granddaughter, bringing the ceramic hummingbird wrapped carefully in tissue paper. I'd asked Rebecca beforehand if I could give it to Clara eventually, passing it down as a family heirloom. Rebecca had cried and said yes, that she loved the idea of the hummingbird surviving another generation. But for now, it would stay on Rebecca's mantle, waiting until Clara was old enough to understand its significance. I held Clara and looked at Rebecca, exhausted and radiant in the hospital bed, and thought about how far we'd traveled from that February day when she'd called me an expense. The journey had been painful, but necessary. Rebecca was a devoted mother, attentive without being smothering. She and her husband created a warm home full of books and music and laughter. They lived modestly, despite having wealth most people couldn't imagine. They donated regularly to causes they cared about. They volunteered as a family once Clara was old enough to participate. Rebecca made sure Clara knew her great-grandmother Janet, who babysat every Thursday while Rebecca and I worked at the food bank together. Clara grew up understanding that family meant showing up, contributing, caring for each other even when it was inconvenient. She grew up watching her mother apologize when she made mistakes and work to do better. She grew up with the ceramic hummingbird on the mantel, a symbol she didn't yet understand, but would someday. I watched my daughter raise her daughter and saw the cycles finally breaking, the damage from Tom's generation stopping with Rebecca's deliberate choices. On Clara's 5th birthday, Rebecca gave a speech at the party that caught me off guard. She talked about mistakes and forgiveness and the people who refuse to give up on you even when you've given them every reason to. She looked at me when she said it, her eyes wet. She said she'd almost lost everything that mattered over money and pride, and the person who'd saved her was standing in this room. She didn't name me directly, but everyone knew. Clara was too young to fully understand, but she'd have the video someday when she was older. Rebecca also announced that she'd established a foundation in Douglas Brenner's name, focused on financial literacy and family counseling for inheritance recipients. She said she wanted to prevent other families from making the mistakes she'd made. The foundation would launch next quarter. Carl was on the board, as was Warren Phelps Jr. Rebecca asked if I'd join too. I said yes. The work felt important, turning our painful experience into something useful for others. The foundation thrived. We held workshops about managing sudden wealth, about the psychological impacts of inheritance, about maintaining relationships when financial dynamics shifted. We funded family therapy for people navigating estate disputes. We published research about the emotional challenges of inheriting significant assets. Rebecca shared her own story anonymously in our materials, talking about how she'd almost destroyed her most important relationship in pursuit of financial optimization. The response was overwhelming. People wrote in sharing their own struggles, thanking us for addressing topics most financial advisors ignored. The foundation became Rebecca's primary focus beyond motherhood. She hired a small staff and rented office space and treated it like the important work it was. Carl said his uncle would have been deeply pleased by this use of the inheritance, that it honored Douglas's values more than any plaque or building could. Years passed in the quiet way they do when life is finally stable. Clara grew older, started school, developed her own personality and interests. She loved art like her mother had, covering the refrigerator with drawings. Rebecca and I maintained our Thursday tradition at the food bank, our Sunday dinners with extended family. Janet stayed in remission, celebrating each cancer-free anniversary with determination. Mark retired from teaching and took up woodworking, making furniture for everyone in the family. Rebecca's husband got a promotion at his nonprofit. They talked about having a second child. I turned 70 and felt younger than I had at 50, probably because I was no longer carrying the weight of wondering if my daughter truly loved me. The answer was evident in every phone call, every visit, every choice Rebecca made that put people above profit. We'd both learned what we needed to learn, paid the prices we needed to pay. The rest was just living. Block 12 complete, 11,995 words. On the 10th anniversary of the inheritance, Rebecca suggested we visit Douglas Brenner's grave. Neither of us had been since his funeral. We drove to Cincinnati on a bright Saturday morning, leaving Clara with her father. The cemetery was well maintained, with rolling hills and old oak trees. Douglas's headstone was simple granite with just his name and dates, no flowery epitaph. Rebecca placed flowers on the grave, daisies like the ones she'd brought me years ago. We stood there quietly for a while. Then Rebecca spoke to him like he could hear. She thanked him for the inheritance, but more importantly, for the conditions he'd placed on it. She said those 72 hours had been the worst and most important of her life. She said she'd become someone she was ashamed of, but his clause had given her a chance to course correct before it was too late. She said his money had done tremendous good, but the real gift had been forcing her to confront who she was becoming. I added my own thanks, telling Douglas that his nephew's daughter was raising a good kid, that the money had stayed in responsible hands, that the food bank was feeding thousands of families every month. I said I'd only met him twice, but I'd been thinking about him regularly for a decade, because his decisions had shaped my family's trajectory. I said I hoped wherever he was, he could see that his plan had worked. Rebecca squeezed my hand. We walked back to the car slowly, reading headstones and talking about legacy. Rebecca said when she died, she wanted her obituary to mention the foundation and the food bank, the things she'd built that helped people. She said she didn't want to be remembered as a woman who'd inherited money, but as someone who'd used it right. I told her she was already that person. She just needed to keep being it. The drive home was peaceful. We stopped for lunch at a diner Douglas had apparently frequented, according to information Carl had shared. The waitress was an older woman who vaguely remembered him, said he always ordered the meatloaf and tipped well. We ordered meatloaf in his honor, and it was mediocre, but that somehow made it more meaningful. Rebecca paid and left a generous tip. We talked about Clara, about the foundation's upcoming projects, about Janet's latest garden plans. We talked about ordinary things because we'd earned the right to be ordinary together. The inheritance was just background now, not the defining fact of our relationship. It had broken us and then forced us to rebuild stronger. Neither of us would have chosen that path, but we'd survived it. That counted for something, maybe for everything. When we got back to town, Rebecca dropped me at my house. The ceramic hummingbird was still on her mantel, but we'd had a replica made for my windowsill, so I had my own version of the reminder. Rebecca hugged me goodbye and promised to call tomorrow, like always. I watched her drive away, her car disappearing around the corner toward her own home and her own family. I went inside and made tea. The house was quiet and comfortable, truly mine in every sense now. I thought about that February day a decade ago, when everything had nearly fallen apart. I thought about how close we'd come to losing each other over money and pride and the terrible advice of a lawyer with silver cufflinks. I thought about noon clauses and second chances and how sometimes the worst moments create the possibility for the best outcomes. The tea was hot and sweet. Life was good. It had taken a long, painful road to get here, but we'd arrived. The story of the inheritance wasn't really about $33 million. It was about a mother and daughter who'd almost lost each other and chose to fight their way back. It was about recognizing your worst self in time to change course. It was about conditions that seemed cruel, but turned out to be merciful. It was about Douglas Brenner, who'd been wise enough to protect his fortune from the corrupting influence of sudden wealth by making it conditional on human decency. It was about ceramic hummingbirds surviving against odds, about making things with imperfect hands and treasuring them anyway. It was about family, the real kind, the kind you build through showing up consistently even when it's hard. The money enabled good things, funded important work, secured futures. But the real inheritance was learning that relationships can't be optimized like asset portfolios, that some things have value beyond any dollar amount, and that being called an expense by someone you love can either destroy you or refine you into something stronger. We chose stronger.